one guy was home for 2 of the games while attending his father while his father was killed in New Mexico, for example. Others didn't play every game because they were injured. So there were also about another 8 guys that played second string, that played in 1 or 2, maybe 3 games, but no more than 3. And the first game they played, as we talked about in the cover, was against the Missouri team from Laredo. And the Missouri came over with their team and 500 rooters, and they played in Corpus Christi. And Second Texas National Guard beat them 30-0. Now, prior to that, the Second Texas National Guard tried to get the Third Texas National Guard, which was also stationed in Corpus Christi, to play them. And the Third Texas took a look at the boys, those boys, and said, "We're not playing." So then they scheduled a game against Texas A&M University. It was the end of the football season. A&M had already finished their season. And they were getting on the train on a Saturday morning to go up to College Station when word came down from above, you will only play Army teams, no colleges. So that game was canceled the day of the game. So they skirted around, found the Missouri team, and walked them 33-0. And then they played the first Wisconsin Infantry in San Antonio, and they beat them from San Antonio. They beat them in Corpus Christi. This was about 10 days later. They beat them 60-0. And then Missouri All-Stars. Missouri challenged Second Texas to another game, but this time they wanted their pick out of 15,000 men in Missouri, in the Missouri Laredo camp. They could pick their best players, and they would put a team together to play Second Texas, which they did. And Second Texas only won 14-0. That's not because Missouri was so good. It's because they were playing 15 men. 4 of them were officials. And every time the Second Texas got close to scoring, somebody would be holding, or there would be an interference call, or there would be some kind of injury call. And so they scored 14 points in the first quarter and ended up not scoring anymore, just protecting themselves from punches and kicks for the rest of the game. Then they decided they would go to San Antonio and play the first Virginia Artillery. They beat them 53-0. I think Virginia crossed the 50-yard line twice. And then they played the 4th Nebraska Infantry, 68-0. They beat them. And the final game of the season, supposedly, was the New York Infantry from Far, Texas, which is, you all know, is in the valley. And New York Infantry had a player on their team that had played, was an All-American from Syracuse, and he was bragging, and he said, "We're going to run up the score to 40 points to nothing, and then when we get to 40 points, we'll put in the subs so the Texans will not be embarrassed." And the boys heard about that brag, and they decided to score 100 points, which they did. 102-0. Now they were supposed to play a six game season, and the Nebraska Infantry and the New York Infantry were supposed to be their last 2 games. Those were the best teams in the South, so to speak. And so Second Texas showed them that they weren't very good teams. So the Army brass, in their wisdom, decided that was not enough. First of all, by then, the nation heard about the Second Texas football team. They were in the newspapers all over the country, and people were clamoring for more games. Now, 1916 had ended, so we're now in January of 1917, and Dwight D. Eisenhower was charged to put together a team out of 20,000 players in San Antonio. There are 20,000 men stationed around San Antonio. guys that they were playing were hand-picked players. Back in those days, there was no pro football, so college players would enlist in the National Guard. Enlisted in the National Guard, and that's how they ended up playing all these great teams. So he had to pick up 20,000 players, and they played on a Tuesday afternoon in January, and it turned out to be an ice bowl. It was freezing temperatures, rain, sleet, and snow. And so the Second Texas ended up, oops, I'm going wrong way. Second Texas ended up winning the game, but it was 34-6. And by this time, for the first 6 games, Second Texas was uncoached. They coached themselves. So when this new deal with the last 2 teams came in, they decided they needed a coach. So they enlisted Tubby Graves, who was a football coach at Texas A&M, to come in and coach them. And he said the main thing he did was try to keep them from beating each other up. He decided that they were going to play on Tuesday afternoon. The last game of the season would be in San Antonio on Saturday, 4 or 5 days later. So he decided to rest the starters in the 4th quarter, and that's when those 6 points were scored. They were leading 34-0 at the end of 3 quarters. And then the second string allowed a touchdown. And the starters regretted that for the rest of the game. So after they went down, they went home. One of the players ended up going to the hospital. He had a ruptured kidney from play. But this was one of the advertisements for the San Antonio game. The biggest athletic event ever held in the South. Second Texas Infantry versus the New York Cavalry. And each team, well, no, the Eastern teams had All-Americans and lettermen from major universities around East. And that's where the general public believed that the best football in the world was played among the Ivy League and Eastern colleges. So they ended up with this game at Leach Park in San Antonio, and it was a big deal. They even had like a 20-page program. It listed all the players and had a lot of advertisements. The bar team, or the team from the Valley, okay, that team was made up of the New York Infantry was made up of their choice of players from 14,000 troops in the Rio Grande Valley area. So here we have the Second Texas 14 guys playing major games against teams that are hand-selected to beat them. And they were set up to beat them. Dwight D. Eisenhower was given instructions to make sure they beat the Second Texas, as was the New York Infantry team. They did not want the Texans to walk away undefeated. So that's the team. Some of the picked athletes who have put Texas on the map for all time. So this was the battle of Texas versus the world. Isn't that always the way it is? So that's the boys, 14 guys. So they ended up winning that last game 76-0. One of the players had one of the opposing players had raised $10,000, and he was giving 20-1 odds against Second Texas. So the Second Texas raised $500 and took that bet. And the boys actually ended up pretty well. They became pros. So the 12th Division All-Stars from Austin, they would beat 34-6. And then the New York Cavalry, they beat 69-0. So their total combined score was 432-6. So I maintain that for the level of play that it was, because these are essentially guys that today would be pros, but there was no pro football. They not only played, but they beat and only scored 6 points in 8 games. Had only 6 points scored against them. That with that record and that level of play and the quality that existed at the time, they were the greatest team to ever play the game. And so that's what we call the world's greatest football team. A slightly provocative title, but I think it's appropriate. So Valentine's Day is so, ladies, don't waste your time on candy or dinner for your husband. Give him something that will last the rest of his life. Give him a book that he can look at and refer to and treasure. Is that candy or dinner? Won't last very long. So I brought a few books with me, so I think I can sell you one. They're $45, and I can take a cash checks and credit cards. That's $44.95 plus tax and shipping on there. But I will take $45 even and call it a day, and I'll pay the tax on Sam. Okay. So that's the end of the talk. You know, I can answer questions if anybody has any. I can tell you that they played an unorthodox way. Back in those days, they had a quarterback behind the line, and you had 2 or 3 backs behind them they handed off. The Second Texas did that some, but most of the time the quarterback was back in a shotgun formation with backs behind him. And they would play, they were all fast and big. They could get virtually the entire team in interference. If they did a run by man, there might be 7, 8, even 10 guys in front of the ball carrier opening up the way. But they also threw a lot of passes. There was one guy who could throw it the entire length of the football field. They didn't know where it was going to go. They were really great athletes. They were great men. 3 of them became professional athletes after all. So what happened to them after the last game? They were sent home. They were allowed to go home for 2 weeks. When they came back, the National Guard was discharged. Then a month later, they were all called up to go into training for World War I. And they were, the Second Texas was disbanded, as was the Third Texas. They no longer had those kind of troops. They mixed them all together with Oklahoma into the Arrowhead Division. So the team was no longer, there was no way to put that team back together again. So they never played as a team again. Some of them continued to play football with other teams. 2 of them became professional football players. One of them became a professional baseball player. We had Johnny Manziel. He didn't work at it very hard. But he did have like a 23 season with pros at one point. He was a really good player, but he was more interested in eating and partying and hunting. And then 3 of them went on to become generals in World War II. And these guys were studs. They were all very successful after their football career. And we traced them all the way through. So you can find out what happened to them.
Any questions?
What did I miss?
Hold on a second.
Jim, you said all 14 guys played offense and defense. What about special teams?
There was no special teams in those games. They played everything. One of the linemen in one of those games, I think it was the 102-0 game, one of the linemen made 2 interceptions. I mean, and most of the time, nobody crossed the midfield very often. They played great defense as well as great offense. These guys were real stuff. They were true Texans. Yes, sir.
Have any films from them?
Of course not. You've seen all the pictures that we know of that exist. I collect all the postcards of South Texas. So I'm up in the biggest postcard show of the years in York, Pennsylvania in November. So I'm up in York, Pennsylvania looking for postcards of Corpus Christi and Fort A and so forth. And I'm looking at a category, they're real photographic cards. So they're photographic cards that these were World War I era photographic cards. And I'm looking through and I find 8 of them, and they say MO at CC. I figured that has to be Corpus Christi. So all I knew was the football game. I bought them, didn't pay much for them because nobody knew what it was. So eventually I find out about this team, and the first game they played was against Missouri. So I have, as far as I know, the only photographs of them playing football in existence. They're all in the books. And so that's one of the things that we had. I had that program that I had as a copy. The guy who bought it on eBay many years ago made me a copy because I was the underbidder. And he has since passed away, and I tried to locate his heirs to see what happened to that program, but I guess it's been in the trash.
Jim, when you say you collect postcards, how many do you have?
I have about 750 or 800 quarter ranches. I have a total of 7,000, which is about 4,000 are Corpus Christi. The big one, the big collection is the Corpus Christi quarter ranches, Francis Pass, and Rockwood. Like everything from where the moving trains are at the wildlife refuge to Serena, in between 5 counties around Corpus Christi. So, and I collect a lot more stuff than that. I collect photographs and books. Oh, it's a sickness. So that's what books pay for. They help pay me to collect. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Yeah, they have goals, field goals?
Yeah, they didn't kick field goals because that ball was not very reliable to kick field goals. But they did have goalposts. And, but there's no record of the Second Texas scoring a field goal.
Earl, Brad.
The football.
Never done this before.
I've never seen one of those either, so.
Well, I've had the pleasure of reading 6 or 7 of Jim's books, and if you're here, you're interested about the coastal bend, and you can't go wrong reading any of the 19 books based on the 7 that I've read. That's just a comment. The other comment I would make, Jim and I visited on an All Souls Day at the military cemetery in Corpus Christi. And I just wanted you to describe what goes on there, because a lot of these people got here in October or November, and if they were, it's a really interesting day.
The military cemetery in Corpus Christi is just gorgeous. But I don't think you visited with me.
Yeah, I bought 3 or 4 books.
See, I walked it.
My wife bought 3 or 4 books.
You can think on a mini Arlington or something like that. It's just a beautiful place, and it's growing. There are lots of veterans in this area of Texas because a lot of them were in World War II, and a lot of them trained at the Naval Air Station, married local girls. Somehow they ended up coming back here. They married a local girl, and then a lot of guys were stationed here and found out what a great place it is to live. And so I was looking on a map. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Been here since 1981, though, so I'm a native. And I got down here in 1981, and on January 1st, it was over 70 degrees, and took my girls out to the beach, in their bathing suit, took a picture of their dudes. My dad was about ready to retire, sent my dad and mom 8x10s of the girls in their bathing suits on January 1st. My parents were down here for 2 weeks. Immediately thereafter, from Cleveland, Ohio, and eventually they ended up being winter Texans, like a lot of you, and ended up spending 3 weeks out of every month here until my dad passed away. It was really great place to come, and you're here. We had winter last week when it got cold. Okay, anybody else got a question? Yes, sir.
You know, in the National Football League, they're the keepers of the rules. And they're the ones who set the rules, and I was just wondering, how did they maintain order in the rules that they ran the games by, and all went on, what was going on?
There were rules written down early on, and Walter Camp, who was the semi-inventor of football, was the guru on football, and they had NCAA, well, it wasn't the NCAA back in that time, but they had conglomerations of colleges that met and worked together, and Walter Camp worked with them, so they had delineated rules. One of the rules was you had to get 5 yards and 3 downs, then they changed it to 10 yards and 3 downs, and they changed it to 10 yards and 4 downs. So they changed what a field goal was worth and what a touchdown and so forth. So all of that evolved in the 1880s to about 1905. So, and they since the colleges were all playing each other, they all followed the same. And that was the main thing. Colleges were playing. And then so were some high schools. We didn't talk, there's a chapter in there on Texas football also, because Texas was not considered to be a football hotbed. But in 1911, up until 1911, A&M had won one game out of 19 against UT. In 1911, they won both games. 1912, they won another. They didn't play Texas in 13, 14, or 15 because Texas canceled the season, the games. And they said, ostensibly, because A&M was cheating. And they all did it. They would bring in a ringer who had played for another team, maybe in Sewanee or someplace in the South, and you were supposed to sit out a year, just like you were until a couple of years ago, and they wouldn't sit him out. They caught one guy who had changed his name so he could play for A&M. And they asked him, why did you change your name? He says, my parents don't want me playing football, so I didn't want them to know I was playing and playing. And then the next year, UT got caught, and the player used the same excuse. So they used that as a pretense, but UT was very upset about losing 3 games in a row to A&M and didn't play for a couple of years. But it's been an intense rivalry right from the beginning. So we have a chapter on what became the Southwest Conference football. The players, there was 14 of them. About 8 of them played for UT, 4 of them played for A&M, and 2 others came from Southwestern and Rice. So it was mostly an A&M and UT game, and those were the 2 powerhouses in football back in Texas in those days. And these guys all played 2 or 3, 4 years. All were lettermen. Some of them were all Southwest Conference, and they were just great athletes. And they had, some of them had been out for a couple of years. Some of them had been called up and were still students. But they were really quite good players. What else did I miss?
What was the attitude of the folks up north about who was best at football?
Well, everybody in the north thought that there was no real football played in Texas. This is a team that showed the world that Texans not only do how to play it, but do how to play it better than everybody else. And ever since then, Texas football has pretty much respected. Of course, last year, just recently, Texas played against Ohio State. I'm from Ohio, so you do a lot of didn't go to Ohio State. But Texas has been on the football map from 1916, 1917 on. Yes, sir.
Who's going to win the Super Bowl?
I don't care.
I don't either.
I don't like the Eagles because I grew up as a Cleveland Browns fan, and then I moved to Dallas, and I was a Dallas Cowboy fan. So if those 2 are not in, I really don't care who plays, except I still hate the Eagles in Washington and New York. So I guess we'll vote for Kansas City. But it should be interesting. What else do we need to talk about? Anything? Yes, sir.
What's the subject for number 20 book?
There's a guy in Corpus Christi by the name of Bill Chris. He is a fairly prominent lawyer, brilliant guy. He's got a PhD in history, in theology, and law. And he's been a prominent lawyer in town. And a number of years ago, he wrote some reminiscences that were in the newspaper about what he remembered growing up in Corpus Christi. And he came to me in December and said, I think I'd like to turn those into a book. So I got an email on Friday with about 30 of those articles in it. And I'm in the process of laying them out, and I've been reading them, and they're fascinating. I didn't grow up here, so it's a window into what it was like. But I was talking about that to a friend of mine, because guys that grew up in South Texas, I grew up in the north, and you know, all of you were probably feral kids. Mom would turn you out in the morning, get lost, and come home at 5 o'clock, or when you're hungry, or maybe when it's dark. And I was part of that too. But down here, they did that, but there were so many different things. Because you had the bay, and you had fishing, and all kinds of stuff. And it was a relatively small town. In the 60s, there was 150,000 people here at most. And so these guys all have different experiences, and they all tell me these stories, and I want to get a bunch of them together and have them start telling stories about what they did. There's a drainage ditch in Corpus Christi that's called Boys Canyon. It was called Boys Canyon, and all the boys used to go play and talk about that with some ladies. They said, we used to go there too. So, but another buddy of mine who said he would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and go fishing, and then he'd take fish home, mom, dinner, and then he'd go to school. Different kind of life than what I grew up with. So I think that would be fascinating to get, because today's kids don't have those experiences. And I think, you know, if you were to go back with some of your old buddies and record some of your what you used to do as a kid, people would be just fascinated with that. I know I am. So I want to get that book done too. The next one's probably going to be built first. And then I have written, for 15 years, I've written a monthly newsletter article in Corpus Christi Yacht Club bulletin on local history. It's usually about 500 words and 6 to 10 pictures. And the whole idea behind that was that I would write 1 month, and then eventually I would combine them into a book. And so I started on that. That'll probably be next year. So the goal was to get 20 books done. Now the goal is 25. But it's fun. That's what I do for fun. I work full time. I'm in the gas compression business, and so I do bean counting. Never something about something. So books are just books and collecting are just fun. Alan in the back and I are work together. He collects souvenirs of Corpus Christi, and I collect postcards. So if I see something really neat on eBay, I let him know, and he decides whether he wants to buy it. You never know what you're going to get. The plate game, by the way. So that's it. Thank you for coming.